by the Kennedy School Institute of Politics and by the John M. Olin Distinguished Lecture Series in Philosophy and Free Institutions. Our speaker tonight is Mr. Elliot Abrams. After his speech, there will be two respondents, Mr. Gregory Treverton, who was formerly on the staff of the National Security Council in the Carter administration, and who is the author of a book on the United States and Western Europe called Making the Alliance Work, and is also an expert on Latin America. And the second respondent will be Professor Fergie Dominguez of the Department of Government at Harvard, who was the author of the authoritative book, Cuba, Order and Revolution. Elliot Abrams is a New Yorker. He graduated from Harvard in class of 1969 and studied at the London School of Economics, and then also graduated from Harvard Law School in 1973. Having been an attorney who practicing for a while in New York and in Washington, D.C., he also worked in the United States Senate, first as assistant counsel to the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in 1975, then as special counsel to Senator Henry Jackson and to Senator Daniel Moynihan, ending up as Senator Moynihan's chief of staff. In 1981, Mr. Abrams became Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, and then in December of '81, he became Assistant Secretary of State for Human Affairs and Humanitarian Affairs. He is now U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. His topic tonight will be Democracy in Central America, its friends and its enemies. I'd like to say that after Mr. Abrams talks and the two respondents respond, there will be a period for question and answer from the audience.
Thank you for, in many ways, a very special welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I've actually never been, I don't think I've ever set foot in this building before and seen what it looks like. It's a pleasure to be here. There's one problem with the title. We've had three different titles. At one point, an error made it Democracy in America, which is beyond my competence completely. Democracy in Central America, Democracy in Latin America. But the title I really want is Democracy in Latin America. I want to have a little bit broader scope than just Central America. This is the 25th anniversary of the Alliance for Progress. And there were, when it was set up by President Kennedy, some very high hopes about the development of democracy and about economic development in Latin America in the 60s, for example, which didn't pan out all that well. If you look back at the last 25 years, certainly in the area of democracy, there has been some development in the 60s and 70s, but it was essentially a period of pretty extensive military rule. On economic development, I'll come back to this in a minute, there were periods of very extensive growth, but now, for most countries, this is a very tough period of no growth. If you stand back from the politics of any particular year or any particular president's term, one of the most striking developments, and the one that may in fact in no small part determine the ability to grow economically and the ability to maintain democracy, is the population. If you look at Latin America, when Kennedy looked at it at the beginning of the Alliance for Progress and you look at it today, the population increase is really rather staggering. 30 years ago, 25 years ago, the population of Latin America was lower than the population of the U.S. The United States had a larger population then than all of Latin America put together. Right now, the population of Latin America is about 412 million, and by the end of the century, which is not very far away, it will be 600 million because the growth rates are very high. We're projected to have about 250 million people in the year 2000. So from being smaller than the U.S. in terms of population, Latin America will be more than double our population. There is in some countries a reduction in the level of population growth, and Mexico is a good example of that. They have a good, successful population control program, but it's not helping much today, because what matters today is whether you had a good, successful population control program 15 years ago. What is happening in Mexico today is that a very large number of people are joining the labor market. Now, I use Mexico because it's the most extraordinary example, but there are plenty of others. Mexico needs to create 900,000 jobs a year. It isn't creating any jobs. What happens in countries in which there are very large numbers of people entering, let's say the years from 15 to 25, and there isn't any work for them where they are? One thing that happens is they go to the cities, and you have in fact seen massive explosions of urban populations. The urbanization of Latin America is another central phenomenon. Mexico City, again, is the best example. From 5 million people when the Alliance for Progress started to 32 million in the year 2000. Right now we count about 18 million, so it's growing phenomenally. That population growth, that growth of urban centers like Mexico City, that inability to create jobs is an explosive combination. It wasn't without its explosiveness in this country in the 60s. The situation is much more explosive in Latin America. There will be lots of trouble. The population pressure on the land is too great. In El Salvador, for example, which is the most densely populated country in the Western Hemisphere, something like 250,000 people had left to come to the United States by 1970, which is to say in a period of decent economic growth in El Salvador and a period of relatively low levels of violence by today's standards. The pressures on social services are great. The pressures on the land are great. The pressures on political institutions are enormous. Mexico has an advantage here, which is us, namely the tremendous amount of illegal immigration across the border, which is obviously a kind of a escape valve pressure. But if one looks at the underlying situation, it's a very dangerous one from the point of view of both economic growth and political stability. Now, there's been a fair amount of progress, nevertheless, in the last few years on the political side. About 10 countries have become democratic in the last 6 or 7 years in a really meaningful sense. I mean, you take a country like Argentina or Uruguay, as Brazil, as exceptionally good examples of that. The policy of the United States is to support in every way we can that trend towards democracy. If you put aside, which we should not, but just for analytical purposes, put aside the moral point as to why we should be for democracy, it is in our interest to be for democracy. It is good for our national security to be for democracy. Polarization and extreme political behavior are much less likely in democracies. They're not impossible, as we know, but they are much less likely. The kind of dictatorship that produces a Batista and then a Castro can be avoided in countries which can turn toward democracy, and El Salvador is a good example of that. Democracy is the best, and in fact, I think you'd have to say it's the only protection of human rights. It is also a very good basis for economic development, and this is a point that I think a very large number of analysts missed. It was easy to assume, and Pinochet's Chile was the example usually cited, that for purposes of economic development, it was good to have a military dictatorship because you'd have a tough guy on the job and he would impose some kind of good economic plan, and then the economy would grow, and if anybody objected to it, why, they would just be jailed. Again, putting aside for analytical purposes the moral point as to why one should object to that, it's wrong. I mean, it's just wrong. If you look what's happening in Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay, the fact is that democratic governments are better able to bring about a decent economic policy, because in many of these cases, a decent economic policy requires a certain degree of sacrifice on the part of the people. They don't want to make that sacrifice for a dictator, but they are willing to make it on behalf of a government that they chose, on behalf of a president who was elected. So even from the economic point of view, democracy is preferable. It's a lot easier for us in general. We have much better relations with countries like Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, El Salvador, Guatemala now than we did when they were military dictatorships. So from every point of view, it is in our interest. And it is therefore our policy to promote that interest and try to push as we can the expansion of democracy and push economic growth. Now, let me turn for a moment to the enemies, which is the interesting question. In theory, these are causes that nobody is against. And there is a sense in which economic growth, in fact, nobody is against. I mean, people have their own interests hurt in a short-term sense, but fundamentally, everybody's in favor of economic growth. The government may wish to appropriate that growth and misuse it, but it's democracy that political stability that have a large number of enemies, and this is true throughout Latin America, not just in Central America. So let me turn to identifying some of these enemies. And the first one, and one which I think we underestimate very greatly, is narcotics trafficking. The threat to democracy in a country like Colombia or Bolivia or Peru, and I think if you look down the road into the 90s, Mexico, the threat from narcotics trafficking is enormous and usually underestimated. These are poor countries. The amount of money available to narcotics traffickers to purchase elements of the government, purchase elements of the army, purchase elements of the police, purchase governors, ministers, presidents, is almost unlimited. One anecdote by way of showing what we are up against and how little we have to go up against it. We sent somebody over to Switzerland a while ago to talk to the Swiss authorities about a kind of agreement on Swiss banking laws under which they would notify us about what seemed almost certainly to be narcotics money being deposited in a numbered Swiss bank account. And the Swiss who we were discussing this with said, you know, well, we said, if it's somebody who's never had a Swiss bank account, who has no visible means of support, who's not in any business, who fits every possible notion one has about narcotics trafficking, you know, large initial deposit, that sort of thing. Under those circumstances, would you notify us? And the Swiss official in question said, what's a large initial deposit? And we thought, well, you know, you can't make it too low, say $1 million, because they probably get that every day. If you make it too high, then you won't catch enough people in the net. So we were kind of figuring 5, 10, but never got the answer out because the Swiss official in question said, I'll tell you why I ask you, because last week we had a 27-year-old Colombian come in and never had a bank account in Switzerland, never had a bank account in our bank. And I said, well, what would your initial deposit be? And he said, $70 million. The budget of the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics Matters is $62 million a year. Just in terms of scale, it's really rather staggering. In a country such as Bolivia, you hear story after story about someone who works his way up as a bureaucrat in the public service and gets to be governor of a state and earns, in terms of our salary, something like $13,000 a year. And there is a guy in the town who is known to be a murderer and a drug trafficker, and he makes, you know, $5 million a month. And he lives like it. It corrupts a society completely. And it gives them the money to literally to buy elements of the government, to protect them, so that in some places the police force or even the army is in fact protecting drug laboratories. So I think I've said enough about that, but I think we underestimate the threat, not as a moral issue, not as a health issue only, the political threat that narcotics trafficking can represent and does represent. A second enemy that's being a little bit polemical, maybe problem is a better word, is this whole question of debt and economic policy. Because it is clear that, I think it's clear, in countries which are new and fragile democracies, if democracy means poverty, it's not going to go over very big. There are a number of countries in which it has meant more and more austerity. That is, the period of democratic rule has been a period of worsening economic conditions for the population. Now, part of the problem is economic mismanagement by the countries in question, and that is a part of it which we can't solve. Example, capital flight. It is estimated that Mexicans living in Mexico hold about $50 billion in assets in the U.S. Mexico's total debt is $100 billion. It's a kind of a juxtaposition of figures, but it gives you an order of magnitude. All of the foreign investment that Mexico is seeking, all of the money that Mexico is seeking, could be had if Mexicans would invest in Mexico. Same thing is true to an appreciable degree in the case of Argentina and some other countries. It's not true in the case of Brazil, which actually is the one example of almost no substantial amounts of capital flight. But the debt problem is one that is extreme for a country like Argentina, where they spend about $5 billion a year servicing the debt. In Mexico, they spend about $10 billion a year servicing the debt, which is fantastic for a country at that level of development. There has been substantial growth in Latin America over this period of 25 years, but the oil price rise, which has now been undone, but the oil price rise and the global recession and helped undo those gains. I think it is worth pointing out with respect to debt that we are not in a calamitous situation. The biggest debtor is Brazil. Brazil has $100 billion, $101 billion in debt, and Brazil grew 8% last year. It is therefore clear that debt per se does not prevent economic growth. There's got to be more to it than that. And here I turn back to flight capital again. How do you get Americans to invest in Mexico if Mexicans won't invest in Mexico? Presumably they know the place better than we do. You can't do it. You can, in a sense, force people to invest through the U.S. government. You can take government money. You can try to get the IMF or the World Bank to do it. But it's very discouraging if those who presumably understand the economic situation there best do not seem to have much confidence. What is needed then, in our view, is the kind of reforms that would lead to more investment by nationals of the countries in question in those countries. You would not need the kinds of international efforts that you now do need if there were not such extravagant capital flight, a reflection of the very bad conditions for doing business. Now, there is a kind of intellectual revolution, to overstate it somewhat, but not all that much, in Latin America on economic policy issues. President Sanguinetti, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, gave a speech which was incredibly pro-business. I mean, it was unheard of for an Uruguayan president to speak like that about the need for a successful private sector as an engine of growth. You know about the Plan Austral in Argentina. These are the beginnings of a real change away from the old ECLA, statist, import substitution model for economic development in Latin America. And the Latins, look around, as everybody else does, and look at, for example, Asia, and at the more successful models of economic development, and they are learning lessons. Brazil is a little bit different, but Brazil is virtually a continent in terms of size, population, internal market, and really does defy some of these rules. What do we need to do on this front? Well, one thing we need to do is to make sure that they can sell to us to earn the foreign exchange they need. This is protectionism. This is something that we hear every time we speak to Latin American officials. We have to keep our markets open. We're not doing a bad job so far. If you compare us to Europe, we're doing a terrific job, as a matter of fact. And the agricultural and other policies on trade of the common market are hurting Latin America a great deal. The growth in Latin exports over the last few years is almost exclusively to us, not to the Europeans. Now, let me turn to the political enemies of democracy and economic growth. Political extremism, right and left, terrorism, narco-terrorism, the links between the traffickers and terrorists, and the stimulation and exploitation thereof by communist parties, communist movements, communist governments. It was thought 10 years ago that Cuba really had its hands full in Africa, and that it was sensible to think that Cuba would re-enter the inter-American community peacefully. that the stage that Castro was in was going to be over. It was kind of infantilism and it would end. Wrong. Didn't happen. Cuba remains today an important source of subversion, support for communist movements throughout the hemisphere, as well as obviously beyond it. Cuba is more closely tied to the Soviet Union today than it has ever been. The last few years have been a period probably of closest cooperation and involvement since Castro took over. Obviously, one way of defining our current concern about Central America is that Nicaragua could become a second Cuba. Latin Americans, I think, fully recognize most of these points. They recognize that there is a threat to freedom and democracy in Latin America from Nicaragua and Cuba. There was a time not so long ago, 2 years ago, let's say, when everywhere you went in Latin America, you got a huge argument about the nature of the Sandinista regime. Likewise, I might say you would get that argument in Congress. For the most part, in Latin America, as in Congress, that argument is over. The argument about the nature of the Sandinista regime is not really much heard in Congress anymore. Those who oppose the president's policy generally preface their remarks with a strong criticism of the Sandinista regime. President Arias of Costa Rica, in his inaugural address last week, I think made it very clear that he views this as a struggle for democracy, and he has called Nicaragua a second Cuba. Foreign Minister Caputo of Argentina has said similar things. I think, and obviously people talk a little bit more frankly even in private. The most dangerous amalgam here is the fact that you've got narcotics traffickers who are doing their work for their purposes, and you have terrorists who are almost without exception linked to communist groups. The exception, I would say, is Libyans, who are a growing problem. And the twain do meet. And the best example of that is what happened at the Palace of Justice in Bogota last year. A group of M19 communist guerrillas took over the Palace of Justice in Bogota. 100 people died in the incident, but 11 Supreme Court justices died. And what was interesting is, which justices did they kill and which files did they burn? And the answer is, those justices and those files connected with narcotics trafficker cases. So they were there for their own purposes, no doubt, but also at the behest of the drug traffickers. That's an explosive mix, because one thing that in a democracy like Colombia, there isn't a lot of popular support for a group like the M19. So how do they get the resources to do their work? Well, kidnappings is one way. But there is unlimited funds available to narcotics traffickers. It's a hell of a mix. The terrorists are used to smuggling guns. They can be extremely helpful in the smuggling of cocaine. And the traffickers have lots of money. And they can be extremely helpful in giving the money to buy guns and other larger pieces of military goods. When you throw in a kind of political sophistication, theory of revolution, training that you get from Cuba and other countries, Nicaragua, there are plenty of terrorists from around the world training in Nicaragua. Costa Ricans, for example, 500 Costa Ricans training with the Nicaraguan army. They're not fighting for democracy in Costa Rica when they go home. They're fighting for something else. This is a terribly dangerous mix, and it is a mix which I think is more and more broadly understood in Latin America. It happens at a time when democracy is exploding all over the place in Latin America. And I think by sophisticated measurement, not just by looking at how many people are inaugurated, if you look at the participation level in elections, which is to say, do the people in those countries think the presidential elections they're having are frauds? Participation levels are very high, and they keep growing. Not just in terms of the number of people voting, which is a function of population in part, but participation rates in elections get higher and higher. obviously much higher than ours, but ours are very low. It's an indication of confidence in the elections that are taking place, that in El Salvador, Argentina, Guatemala, the participation rates are very high. Why they're so low in this country is again, beyond my competence. There are today, in fact, only 4 military regimes left in Latin America, with the departure of Duvalier. You may want to call that a family dictatorship rather than a military regime. But Chile, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Paraguay are the only ones that are left, really. And that's not many when you consider the number of countries in the region and the number of new democracies in the region. In the last 10 years, the number of people in Latin America living under democratic government has increased from about 1/3 to a little over 90%. That's really an extraordinary gain. We try to help this in a lot of traditional ways. We try to help it through diplomatic pressure, through security assistance, through AID, through the Peace Corps, through funding private organizations, Save the Children and Catholic Charities, things like that, through the work of the American Institute for Free Labor Development, the AFL-CIO's Latin America arm. And there are some new tools we use, too. For example, we have an administration of justice program which cooperates with the UN and which is trying to do, it's the kind of thing the Asia Foundation does in Asia, actually, build the basic tools of a system of justice, courthouses, libraries, judicial protection for judges who are not corrupt and who face enormous threats. And it is in this context, I think, that you have to ask the very difficult question that Congress is being asked right now, which is, well, how do you do this in Central America? If the consensus in Congress and in Latin America is correct, and obviously I share it, about the regime in Nicaragua, which is it is dedicated not to establishing democracy, but to preventing the establishment of democracy. And what do you do about it? How do you fight those enemies of democracy? There are extreme views. One extreme, I would say, is you just abandon that fight and you say, the hell with it, we are not particularly interested in what goes on in Nicaragua. And the other polar extreme is that you take U.S. military action. Our policy, as you know, is to support the Contras, the Nicaraguan resistance. And we do this because it seems to us that there aren't too many alternatives unless you are willing to acknowledge that it's okay to have a communist regime tied to the Soviet Union in the middle of Central America, subverting its neighbors, which it clearly is doing. A number of the rifles, not just its neighbors, a number of those rifles that took the Palace of Justice in Bogota came from the Sandinistas. So it's not just the neighboring countries. But the neighboring countries obviously feel the brunt first, and they feel it most, El Salvador being the best example. What do you do about that? Do we take an interest in the internal situation in Nicaragua? For example, one theory is you have a non-aggression pact. We leave them alone if they leave their neighbors alone. That solution abandons having a concern for human rights in Nicaragua. Theoretically, we should all be supporting the same thing in Nicaragua that we should be supporting in Chile, which is democracy, or Argentina or anywhere else. But just to take the 4 countries left, Cuba, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and Chile, it would be odd to support democracy in Chile and Paraguay and not in Nicaragua. That's a real double standard. So our policy is to aid those Nicaraguans who are, in fact, fighting for restoration of democracy in Nicaragua. There are about, under arms now, perhaps 20,000, which is the fastest growing resistance or guerrilla group, I think, that you can ever trace having existed. And it doubled in size after Congress cut off U.S. aid, which is interesting as well. Latins have a very conflicted view of this situation. On the one hand, they want to get rid of the Sandinistas because they view the Sandinistas, I'm talking about Latin American governments, they view them as communists who are inimical to the interests of democracy in Latin America. They also oppose U.S. intervention. and for the most part oppose our aid to the Contras. Though not as many oppose it privately as oppose it publicly, most oppose it privately and publicly. They think that the way to handle this is sort of Latin Americanize it. It's a Latin American problem. We Latin Americans can handle it through political pressure. We will isolate Nicaragua if it doesn't reform. We'll force it to reform. We don't think that's going to work. It sure didn't work with Cuba. It's hard to imagine a country that was more isolated diplomatically and politically than Cuba was in the 60s. Through all those OAS resolutions, Cuba had completely alienated a whole number of its Latin neighbors by supporting subversion in them, invasions of them. They were about as isolated as you can get in Latin America. It hasn't changed the regime at all. If you try to pin down what this Latin pressure is supposed to be, it tends to be talk. People seem to want a treaty under which the Nicaraguan government, the exact same government as exists today, promises to be good. And if they're not good, then everyone will editorialize against them and will fulminate against them and will be mean to them. I caricature, but I don't think it's much of a caricature because there's no teeth to it at all. And I don't see why a group of communist leaders in Managua, who are pretty tough guys, should in fact feel the bite of anything except teeth. They're not going to be gummed to death by diplomatic pressure. So our policy is to go beyond diplomatic pressure and to go beyond economic pressure into military pressure, as you know. I want to end on a somewhat more positive and less controversial note. One large problem for democracy in Latin America is going to be if we abandon support for some of the most troubled and fragile Latin American democracies, South American, Central American, Caribbean. We may actually end up doing this under the current Senate and House projected aid levels for FY87, FY88, and onward. If you look at the aid figures that are projected, the political impact is enormous, absolutely enormous. One of the reasons that, Costa Rica, for example, has a phenomenal amount of aid per capita from the U.S. The absolute amount is $120 million this year, which for a country with that population is very large. For purposes of economic support and for purposes of humanitarian relief and for purposes of fighting drug trafficking, we need to have substantial levels of aid to countries such as Bolivia and Peru and El Salvador, Costa Rica, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, and under these levels of aid, we're not going to be able to do it. And that is actually a significant, I would argue, a significant threat to stability and democracy in the coming years. Nevertheless, if you step back, I think it's remarkable. If you go back to 1980 or 1976 and ask virtually any Latin expert, project 10 years ahead to 1986, and tell me how much democracy there will be in Latin America, I don't think there was anybody. Nobody has ever yet sent me an article in which any expert predicted this kind of progress for democracy in the Caribbean and South America and Central America. It's really rather staggering. We have the job now of preserving it, which is extremely difficult, but it is a lot better job to preserve it than it is to enter a situation in which there isn't any and to fight against entrenched dictatorships to create it. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to the question and answer period.
Thanks very much, Mr. Abrams. Our first respondent will be Gregory Treverton.
Let me not focus on the points with which I agree with Secretary Abrams. I think much of what he said about narcotics and debt is exactly to the point. Also, we all look with happiness on the increase in democracy in the region. Some of us would be tempted to say, talking to Latin Americans, that the human rights policies of the previous administration had something to do with the rise of democracy. Instead, I'd like to do something that, as a government official, I could never do, and as a professor, I'm seldom inclined to do, and that's really admit that I'm perplexed and spell out my perplexity for you perhaps as a basis for discussion, perhaps as a basis in a school that thinks that policy analysis means something, to thinking about the problem. I, as a personal matter and as a substantive matter, find our policy toward Central America, where I'd like to concentrate my comments, distasteful, wrong. On the other hand, it seems to me it works. And I want to spell out both those points. It works in the sense that now we're looking at a Congress where the real issue is how big or small the fig leaf is going to be covering the fact of American support to the Contras. In that sense, the game seems to me to be over. And so it leads me into this puzzle. Why is it that a policy I dislike so much seems to me to work so well, at least domestically? I dislike it for reasons that I think are familiar to you. It seems to me to be rather blatant intervention, much more interventionist than the Nicaraguans themselves are at the moment. Since, as I want to say in a minute, it seems to me we haven't seen much real evidence lately that the Nicaraguans are doing a lot by way of supporting rebels in El Salvador. More important, our own intervention seems to me to justify, not in our eyes, but in the eyes of Cubans, Latin Americans, Europeans, almost any posture with respect to Cuba and the Soviet Union that the Sandinistas choose. The second reason I dislike our policies, it seems to me exactly to undercut, in keeping with our subject tonight, our commitment to democracy. We say, I think we mean, that we believe the kind of ideology represented by the Sandinistas, here I agree there's a widespread consensus on it, is alien to our hemisphere, alien to Central America. But on the other hand, we say, well, if it's alien still, it has to be rooted out by force of arms. We say that we can't trust the Central Americans to decide for themselves. Now, no one seems to believe that the Soviet Union is going to make the kind of commitment to Nicaragua it made to Cuba, which would change the calculation. But still, it seems to me we, on balance, push the Sandinistas toward more authoritarian matters. That's a hard point to settle. Finally, it seems to me our current policy is strategically disreputable. We say, our president has articulated, a very severe notion of the threat from Nicaragua. And I think Secretary Abrams has talked about it in similarly grave tones tonight. Our president talks of mass migration northward. At the same time, if that's the threat, then clearly $100 million in aid to some group like the Contras just doesn't fit. There's a huge gap between the threat, the set of strategic interests we've conjured up, and the measures we propose to deal with it. If it really is that kind of threat, then Marines are the answer. We ought to go fix it. That's why I dislike the policy. Here's why it seems to me it works. It works most of all domestically, domestic American politics, and that's after all where policies always succeed or fail. It seems to me there the administration has managed to catch the mood of the American people. If you ask the American people, do you want to live with the Sandinistas? Do you think the Sandinistas have a right to exist in the Western Hemisphere? I think the answer overwhelmingly is no. Secretary Abrams referred to that. At the same time, if you ask the American people, are you prepared to pay much, do much, or pay much to get rid of this menace in the hemisphere, the answer is also no. And that's the combination of attitudes, it seems to me, administration policy catches very well. Tough talk says we don't have to settle for a hemisphere in which the Sandinistas exist. On the other hand, we're plainly not willing to do very much about it. It works domestically, but I think I also have to admit the policy works in a military or strategic way, or at least there's no evidence, strong evidence to the contrary. I was concerned and have been writing over the last several years about trying to differentiate our interests. And I've always pointed most emphasis on the things it seems to me we really should care about in Central America, which is the presence of Soviet, Cuban bases and facilities, major military facilities, that would pose a threat to us and to our neighbors in the hemisphere, and to arms supplies by the Nicaraguans to the rebels. Well, it seems to me we have to admit neither of those things have happened much. We haven't heard much about Nicaraguan arms supplies to the rebels in El Salvador lately from the administration or anyone else. And so it seems to me we have to admit that either they've deterred those things successfully, or the Sandinistas never meant to do them in the first place. And it seems to me, on balance, we have to say that the policy so far has worked. It has, in fact, deterred those things that I worried about most over the past few years. Then you might say, so what? What's the upshot? I think the problem is that it seems to me our policy leaves us very hostage to fate, that this gap between the threat we define and what we're prepared to do about it basically says if we can just kind of hold on and wait, maybe we'll be lucky. Maybe the Sandinistas will fall. Maybe the Contras will even overthrow them, though I don't know many people who believe that $100 million of aid would help them do that. But maybe we'll be lucky. What worries me is if we're unlucky. Suppose we have some bad luck. We always tell our students here, as a matter of policy analysis, ask yourself, what's the worst thing that can happen? What if I'm very unlucky? Then it seems to me we get the Contras wiped out despite what we do to them or for them. Or El Salvador collapses in some way we can't quite foresee, but isn't out of the question. Then it seems to me this huge gap between the threat we've articulated and what we're prepared to do about it, a gap that's really reflected and I think to some extent exacerbated in the public mood. I think that sets us up for first a nasty debate, then the choice of unpleasant means like armed intervention, which we almost certainly wouldn't do, and then we'd have a long debate about who lost El Salvador or Nicaragua, which it seems to me could be avoided if we just thought a little bit harder, a little bit more strategically about what it is we really have to care about in Central America, as opposed to what it is we like. We'd all like democracy to spring up tomorrow in Nicaragua. The question is, how much are we prepared to do to make it happen, and how much do we absolutely have to have a regime we would like absolutely in Nicaragua? I would like to see them be democratic as well. I don't think it's likely to happen in any case. And certainly to say that, as I think we've come close to saying tonight, that being opposed to aid to the Contras means you're indifferent to the fate of democracy in Nicaragua, that seems to me to get us into exactly the sort of problem I see us in. Let me use that as a basis for your questions.
Okay. A brief response then. I think there are two judgment questions, and they're judgment questions. They are not fact questions, which separate your views and mine. The first is the judgment question as to how good are the Contras militarily, how much support can they have, what does the $100 million buy you, can the Contras win, that set of issues, which presumably would have an effect if you were persuaded that with this $100 million in a year and a half or 2 years, the Contras would create a democracy in Nicaragua, your views would be affected by that. So that's the first place we disagree, and no one can win that argument because it's a hypothesis. The second place we disagree, another judgment, is the strategic goals which you outline as essential to us, as ones you didn't quite say worth fighting for, but in other places you have come close to it. Soviet bases, Cuban bases, real large increase in the Soviet-Cuban threat to us. I think the question is it possible over a 5 or 10 year period to attain those strategic goals with a communist regime tied to the Soviets, part of the Soviet camp in Nicaragua, in Managua? Is it possible really over the medium run to contain such a regime? Possible in the military sense, possible in the sense of do we have the discipline and the staying power as a political system to pursue that kind of a policy? I think it is largely the difference over those two questions that separates our views.
Our second respondent is Fergie Dominguez.
Thank you. I would like to begin briefly, not to take too much of your time. Again, much agreement with many of the themes that Secretary Abrams raised, the threat to democracy from narcotics, from the economic disaster in the region, including but not limited to the debt problem, from terrorism, be it death squads in El Salvador or be it Sendero Luminoso in Peru, quite different ideologies which nonetheless have a lethal effect on the survival of democratic institutions and procedures. Similarly, I find myself in much agreement with many of the critical comments that Greg Treverton has just made. I thought instead of reiterating these elements of agreement and criticism, that I would focus on some issues with regard to the subject of democracy specifically that Secretary Abrams raised and ask some questions. The first is what I think is the appropriate and welcome shift in the definition of his remarks before us tonight, to try to address concerns not just limited to Central America, but also to South America. One of Mr. Abrams' predecessors, Secretary Enders, in 1982, after the war between Argentina and the United Kingdom, in congressional testimony, noted, I think with genuine regret, that the U.S. government had paid relatively little attention to South America during the preceding 2 years. Indeed, one could even argue for a good period of time, in part because it had been focused on other things, and in the Western Hemisphere, almost exclusively on Central America. So the first comment is to welcome the shift that he has signaled, which I think is not only his own, though that in itself is important and praiseworthy, but more general. And the question is, why did it take so long? Why was it? I think it's an appropriate question, and as Greg said, in a school of government. Why was it that it took such a sustained period of time for the U.S. government, not just this administration, to realize that the substantial interests for the United States in the hemisphere lie primarily in the countries to which we had collectively paid the least attention? Second question is really identical to the first. Why did it take so long? But in this case, why did it take so long to pay attention to the significance of democracy for U.S. foreign policy and for the people and the values for which the U.S. seeks to stand? It is, after all, worth recalling that Jeane Kirkpatrick wrote, I think with a clear tone of regret, that the Carter administration had pushed Somoza out of power. That Roger Fontaine, the first National Security Council staffer for Latin America, blamed José Napoleón Duarte and his military allies in El Salvador for too much reform, for bankrupting El Salvador. Worth recalling that, again, Assistant Secretary Enders spoke about the virtues of Chilean economic performance. As it turned out, literally only weeks before it became clear that the Chilean economy was collapsing, and I welcome your assessment that that was both substantively incorrect as well as mistaken in terms of long-term U.S. policy interests. Nonetheless, that was the view of the early Reagan administration. So too was President Reagan's defense of Guatemalan President Rios Montt at the moment of the most repressive period in that country. So too was the dismantling of policies the U.S. government had pursued in the late 70s with regard to Argentina, and the close cooperation with the Argentine government in 1981-1982 on a variety of issues, including cooperation whereby the Argentines sent military advisors to Central America to assist elements of U.S. policy. The record of 1981 and 1982 and early 1983, from the perspective of U.S. government support for democratic values and institutions, I think the gentlest thing that could be said about it is that it was quite poor. I welcome personally the change, and the question again is, why did it take so long to recognize that that was the right direction to go? A similar question, though in many ways a question about the same theme, though from a quite different perspective, might be to attempt to recapture that part of the conservative political argument with regard to the critique of the Carter administration's human rights policy. And I think in a debate like this, it's useful and important to recall that argument, I think, in its most important sense, namely, that the United States ought not to be a subversive power, that the interests of the United States should be focused on a set of interests primarily dealing with the foreign policy behavior of other countries, and not be so concerned with the internal arrangements, however much the U.S. government would prefer democratic institutions, that the limits on the capacity of the U.S. government and the problems that it would incur were such that efforts to reshape the internal institutions and procedures of other countries was likely to fail and generally inappropriate. This is an argument conservative with a small c, in the sense that it is both critical of efforts to promote democratic values in today's Chile, just as it would be critical of efforts to promote democratic values in today's Cuba. It is not a position that I hold, but it is a position that I think many in the Reagan administration did hold, one that I think has much intellectual significance to it. And again, the question would be, why was that significant argument set aside on behalf of the one that you articulated tonight? And the last point has to do with the question of the significance, the weight of the question of democracy with regard to the U.S. government's policies toward Nicaragua. Greg Treverton made a number of other remarks with regard to that policy, which I don't want to reiterate. It seems to me difficult to believe that the support for democratic values is a central feature of U.S. policy toward Nicaragua. Again, putting it in the mildest sense, it seems to me that you could make any number of cases that would range from the extraordinary difficulty, with the best of intentions, of creating a democratic regime in Nicaragua, no matter who was in power, to the one that would say that if in fact one wanted to create a democratic regime in a country that has not provided fertile soil for this type of regime at any point in its history, would be to identify those people, in a minority, who seem to support democracy. And I think from that more empirical perspective, one would find some who support the Sandinista government, one would find some who support the Contra movement, and that the policy that would most enhance democratic outcomes in Nicaragua would be one quite different from U.S. support for the Contras or Soviet support for the Sandinistas, but one that would attempt to fashion, as difficult as it is, the possibility of partial reconciliations that might over the long run bring peace to the country and a democratic regime drawing from those who are now on both sides of this tragic and bloody divide. That would suggest that even from the perspective of the presumed democratic values that you say orient U.S. policy toward Nicaragua, the policy, as Greg Treverton said, is wrong, and I would add here, unlike what he said, ineffective.
Very interesting and very difficult questions. On the question of why did it take so long to give attention to South America, I think first there has been a kind of a division of labor which may be invisible to the public. When we deal with the problem of Nicaragua and seek congressional support for military aid to El Salvador, for aid to the Contras, you read about it in the papers every day. When the agencies which have been very deeply involved on a day-to-day basis with, for example, dealing with the debt crisis in South America, do their job, Federal Reserve Board and Treasury, you don't read about it at all. So I think there is a perception of less activity on South America than has been the case, and I think one should not judge by the degree of public action on these questions. Well, let me just pass on to this very interesting question about human rights policy. Again, I think, the nature of the situation in South America, to take South America as an example, changed. Take Argentina as an example. You said we dismantled Carter policy. Remember how many people disappeared in Argentina in the years that Carter was president? Roughly 10,000. How many people disappeared in the years in which Reagan has been president? Roughly 0. Now, I would argue that Carter policy and Reagan policy obviously had nothing to do with that, but you have to respond to that situation. You cannot have a policy of sort of friendly working relations with a government that is murdering 10,000 of its people, but you have to have a different relationship with a government which, for whatever reason, maybe U.S. pressure, has stopped and is moving towards democracy. I remember these debates over Uruguay. I remember having these debates with my friends in the human rights community in my former job about what should be U.S. policy towards Uruguay, whether there would ever be a democratic election, whether we were being fooled by the military. Well, we were right. Look at Sanguinetti. I can't tell you the number of human rights activists who told me there'd never be an election in Guatemala, Cerezo would never be president, he'd be killed by the military if he got close enough to the election. That was also wrong. So some of these policies, which many people claim are not only invisible but non-existent, I would argue have proved themselves to be rather effective in countries like Argentina and Uruguay. I am not trying, it would be entirely incorrect as a matter of historical fact to take credit to the United States under any president for turning, Uruguay into a democracy. But I think if you ask the players of that period in Uruguay meaning the last 5 years, say the transition in Uruguay or Argentina, what role the U.S. embassy played, what role the U.S. government played, that you would get a rather different response from the one that you identified. Now, that was not, I think, the policy at the start of the Reagan administration. I would agree with you. And it changed. It changed in part with experience. It changed because this policy we think is right, so you try, the policy was, I would argue, was in many ways wrong. It changed. It changed in part because the initial policy was a reaction and obviously an overreaction to Carter policy. Many people in both parties have criticized some of the Carter policies on human rights as being sort of not particularly even-handed. In the unwillingness, for example, to take on the Russians on human rights issues. That overreaction sort of played itself out, and better policies set in. But I also want to give credit to Secretary Schultz, who has a great interest in this and has helped push the policy too. People play a role in this as well. But I think that the evolution is not as great as you indicate, because I think that you get back to the old issue of quiet diplomacy. Is it quiet diplomacy or is it invisible diplomacy? Is it non-existent diplomacy? It's hard, I think, to argue that all of these governments could have become democracies, military dictatorship to democracy, in the Reagan years, if the Reagan administration had not been pushing in that direction. Without exaggerating the American role and American power, it's difficult to support that hypothesis. One final point. Why is in explaining this policy, you may think that Pat Darien, when she was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, had the full support of everybody in the Carter administration. That's not true. It was a bloody battle in the Carter administration, essentially between the geographical bureaus and the Human Rights Bureau. And she won a lot and she lost a lot. Likewise in the within and against the National Security Council, and they won a few and lost a few. The fundamental job of the Foreign Service is to maintain good working relations with the government to which it is accredited, whether that is Chile or the Soviet Union or Mexico or Denmark. And these kinds of policies really go against the grain for traditional American foreign policy of both parties and for the Foreign Service as an institution. So there is a tremendous institutional resistance under any president and under any Secretary of State.
We come now to the question period from the audience. I see that many of you have accomplished the difficult task of approaching a microphone in readiness with your questions. Let me urge you, please, to not to make statements and to keep your questions brief. In your own interest, there's nothing more paralyzing than a brief question. And only professors are entitled to ask long questions. So please, you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Abrams, this question is directed toward you. I think probably most of us in this room read in the Globe today about your refusal to share the table tonight with former U.S. Ambassador of El Salvador, Robert White. I personally feel cheated by his absence and disagree with the school's decision to accommodate your request. My question to you is, what justifies the request, especially in light of the fact that you present yourself as an advocate of democracy?
Well, with all due respect to the school, it was not I but they who violated the rules of the school. As I understand the rules of the School of Government, when you invite a speaker, you also put people on a kind of a panel who are, to some, one hopes, critical of his or her views to make the occasion more interesting. And you ask the speaker about those people, and you ask the speaker always and without exception whether he agrees. That may be a bad rule. It is your rule. You happen to violate it in my case. And I said, wait a minute, I don't think it ought to be violated in my case. I was not asked about Ambassador White. Now, why not Ambassador White? I feel a little bit cheated by Ambassador White. You know, Ambassador White, I'm not here to attack Ambassador White, but the fact is that in the Carter administration, he strongly supported U.S. military aid to the government of El Salvador until January 20th, 1981, and as soon as we had a Republican administration, he turned around on a dime. He didn't try to persuade anybody. He didn't use the usual State Department dissent channels. He didn't work within the system. He just turned around on a dime. So I find the position, if it's a position of principle, well, it cannot be a position